Alright students, so next we are going to do some changes to the actual geometry to add detail to our scene. And last class you guys practiced working with the Edit Poly modifier to shape some primitive shapes into more complex 3D objects. So we're going to use those same tools today to add some physical detail to the ground in our scene, to the arms of the snowman, and the nose of the snowman. We don't want to get too carried away in terms of adding physical detail to our scene, because we're going to add an additional level of detail once we start working with actual textures, which is going to give the plane the appearance of snow, and the snowman itself have the appearance of snow, and a shiny material for the hat, and so on and so forth. So we can create an initial layer of detail with actual physical changes to our shapes, but then we can fill that in yet with another layer of detail using textures, and that's coming up in a little bit. So let's get started. So the first thing we'll do is we will work with our plane, that's the ground. So right now, you guys, depending on what size you made your planes, you want them to be pretty big, because once we render this out as a scene, you know, we want it to look like, you know, the snowman's in the middle of a field. So the more, you don't want to get too crazy, but you want it to be enough that when you're in and you're up close to your snowman model that you kind of don't see the edges, or if you do, you don't see that it's a square. Next, in order to add detail, and we talked about this in the previous video, that there's a balance between how many polygons, which is how many individual segments make up your shape, and the detail. And so right now we only have 4 segments, and that's not going to give us a lot of vertices to work with in terms of adding some, you know, snowbanks and little areas of uneven snow and whatnot. So we want to bring this length and width segments up quite a bit. And if we want to talk about best practice, to be honest, it's easier on the computer if you make your plane square, and then you make your height and width segments the same. So I'm just going to make them 40 and 40, and that's great. So there is our plane, and I'm zooming in because, in fact, I'm gonna bring this up to 80 and 80. Nah, why not? Let's boost it to 100. There we go. All right, so we have a lot of vertices to work with here. So I'm going to show you, we're going to add the Edit Poly modifier, just like we've been doing. And so we're going to find it in the Modify tool toolkit over here. And we're going to make sure we have vertex selection on. So this is where the multiple viewports is going to come in really handy for you. So make sure you have your front, your top, and your left selected, and then you got perspective over here. Okay, so we aren't even going to use the tools that were down here that we used earlier to make our flying saucer and our fork. We're actually going to go up to the regular selection tool here, and we are going to select this irregularly shaped blob thing. Because check this out. If we click and drag, we can make kind of whatever shapes that we want. So I'm going to hit Control to continue my selection. And I'm just going to make a couple of kind of blobby little selections along the along our plane here. And if I move to the Move tool and I right-click in the front viewport, I can hike those up just a tiny bit. Don't go too crazy, again. And then we want to make sure we go back to the Select before we start again. So I'm going to click outside to clear that selection, and I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to hold Control to make sure that I'm getting the whole thing, and I'm going to maybe do one really close to the snowman, and then a couple out in the distance here, and they can overlap, that's totally fine. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring it up a tiny bit, and you'll see a little bit that that's sort of giving us the appearance of an uneven, you know, snow-covered field maybe. So what we can also do is we can do a couple more of these, but this time instead of dragging them up, we'll drag them down a little bit. So we'll make some little gullies and whatnot. So the more you do this, I'm going to give your terrain a little bit of, you know, kind of a variation in height. So it looks like you've got a, you know, field with some stuff covered with snow. And if you, oops, and this is why you want to make sure each time you go to select that you go back to the selection tool, and that way you don't accidentally move something. So I'm going to do a couple really little ones. And you can really get kind of creative here with this and do this however you want, but you don't want to get too crazy with the height because then you'll stretch your plane out and it'll look weird. So just little pieces here and there, and then we can move those up. All right, so I'm going to call it quits right there. And yeah, does it look a little weird for the moment? Sure. But this is just a start in terms of getting our plane to look like a snowy field. And next we can throw a turbo smooth on it to kind of smooth out some of those polygons a little bit. And there you have it. Now again, remember, this is large scale detail. Once we get into textures, we are going to add far smaller imperfections to our surface, and that are going to impact the way light reflects off of it and really give it the appearance of the material of fallen snow, as opposed to these little bumps and depressions that give us that look of a snowy field that is not a perfectly flat surface. All right, so that is great. In the next video, well, I make the next video, now I'll just keep going with this one, why not? We are going to do some detail on the nose of the snowman, so let's get that guy selected, and let's get out of the move tool so that we don't have a problem. And we're going to add the edit poly modifier once again. Perfect. And actually, before I get too far along with this, when I made my snowman, I didn't give that nose any segments along the top. So if I turn off the edit poly and I go back down to the cone, oh, apparently I did. I just don't have my edged faces on. There we go. See? So just check that on your model to make sure that you've got a couple of rings here to work with. And so a carrot has little rings in it. So once again, we can do this one of two ways. We can click one little segment, hold down Shift, and it'll select the ring. Or, with the edge face tool selected, do a grow. Oops, I lied. A loop. And that'll grab the whole thing. So in order to make that little indent, we can do a quick chamfer, however you want to say it. And you want to make sure that you have this as 2. That'll create a new one in the middle. So now we can select the middle one, and we can do a quick scale in the 2 directions. That'll just kind of bring it down a little bit. And that's it. So nothing too crazy here. Just selecting these guys, and you might want to bring that chamfer down a tiny bit once you get closer to the end, because it'll look a little crazy. But and we can do the same thing. Oops, sorry, we already did that. Do a scale. And yeah, does this look a little uniform? Sure. But if you want, you can, skip one and just move on to the next one. You can also, the end of mine is very sharp. Carrots aren't that sharp. So we could actually go up to the vertex selection tool, and I can delete that vertex. And of course now the front is open, but just like in our flying saucer tutorial, we could go to the ring selection, grab that end, and make sure that we cap it, just like that. So I'm just going to do one more quick, and I'm going to get out of the scale tool for the time being so I don't mess myself up. And make sure that I have one of these. Gets a little delicate at the end here. There we go, got one of those, and I'm just going to use the loop so I can quickly select it. and then come down and do a quick chamfer there. Grab that middle one, and then I'll loop it again, and then bring that down a tiny bit. So that's some very basic detail there, and I skipped a couple of these, but I would recommend you do all of them so your carrot has some texture to it. And that's that. So last but not least, let's take a look at how to make our arms look like the sticks. So we are going to select our arm here, and we are going to add our edit poly modifier to it. And you can get as specific or as not specific as you want with this whole thing. And you notice I'm grabbing this magnifier. This magnifier, if you click and drag with the left mouse button when you have it selected, kind of gives you a finer control over your zoom than when you're using the regular Alt. So just a FYI on that. Okay. So back over here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to select a couple of these faces, right? Oop. And I am going to go back down to our tools that we were using earlier. And I'm just going to do a quick extrude. So it's kind of like a branch. And that looks crazy at the moment, but it won't in a second here. So I'm going to use the scale tool. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to use... I gotta make sure I keep my selection, and now I can use the scale tool to kind of bring that down a little bit, bring that way a little bit, and again, this is where modeling in all three viewports is going to be helpful. So I'm just going to leave that there for now. So I can select another few faces of this branch here. And I could do another extrude, or I could do a bevel, because if we remember, our bevel not only brings out the face, but it also does a scale at the same time. You just have to be careful, because this is such a narrow thing that if you drag it too far, it's not going to work right. So I hit the check mark, and then I can do a quick select on two axes there. And again, just kind of drag it. So this is another example of where you want to pay attention to where your each thing is going, because from one angle it may look totally the way you want it, and then on the other side it might look totally weird. And the reason it's a little challenging for me to navigate around is because 3ds Max is trying to compensate for the fact that there is a huge plane in this scene. So if you find it hard to drive, so to speak, you can always hide your plane, and that will make your life a little bit easier. So I'm going to hide the ground, and that's going to make it a little easier for me to navigate. Okay, so I'm going to make another, maybe one or two more branches, and I'm just going to use the same bevel settings as before, and I'm going to, and it doesn't look like I'm doing anything, but I am. Just sort of making that more skinny. And I'm going to take that piece right there, and I'm actually just going to shrink it down a little bit. Right now it looks kind of like an airplane. But in a moment, we will smooth it out, and it'll look a little more like a branch. Okay. So I'm turning off all my selections, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a turbo smooth real quick, and then that will end this video because, and that looks a little whacked, but we will go in and we will do some more adjustments in the next video.